Are ice ages real? Yes. Are they immediate? Yes. Is the next ice age close? Yes. Do we need to be concerned? Yes again. We fail to be concerned because our vision has been boxed in. In the late 1700s, Germany's great poet of freedom, Friedrich Schiller, had lamented that all too often the great moments in history find society a little people. From Schiller's time to ours, more than 200 years have passed, and still the saying is true, perhaps more so than ever. Society has become increasingly small-minded, especially in the context of astrophysics that affects everyone's living on Earth more deeply than anything else. No one is not affected by the effects of the sun on our planet. It becomes important, therefore, to gain a wider understanding of the dynamics that affect the sun, in order that we may adjust our living in accord with the changing dynamics. Our understanding of the cosmic dynamics is especially critical in the case of the next ice age before us, that promises to have gigantic consequences on the Earth, when the sun's radiated energy becomes reduced by 70% on the day the sun goes inactive. That's the day when its external plasma fusion process falls below the minimal supply threshold and stops. The sun then becomes as dim as we see it below the sunspots. The day for this transition, by which the ice ages begin, is near in time, potentially as near as the 2050s. That's when the energy input drops below the minimal threshold that is required for the sun to remain active. The solar wind pressure is a perfect indicator of the still remaining strength and its rate of diminishing. When it drops to zero, the fusion process is doomed to suffer a chain reaction collapse. At this point, the livable zone on the Earth shrinks to the narrow band of the tropics, where the solar exposure is the highest, so that 30% of the current solar radiation will be sufficient to sustain life. While we still have 30 years remaining to adjust our living in accord with the shifting cosmic dynamics, such as by building the infrastructures in the tropics that we will need at this point for relocating all the northern nations into the tropics, in real terms, we are running out of time already. The vast infrastructures will have to be in place and be fully operational before the northern territories become uninhabitable as the result of the 70% reduction of the sun's radiated energy. Because at the point of this transition, the livable area of the world will shrink from the day on when the sun goes inactive and the next ice age unfolds. The consequences of living under an inactive sun are so immense that humanity as a whole came out of the last ice age with a tiny world population of a mere 1 to 10 million people. Yes, 1 to 10 million people. That's all we had left after 2 million years of human development across more than 20 ice ages. The depressing effect of the ice age environments on human living has evidently been so immense that the concept of human history is typically limited to only the minuscule time of the 12,000 years of the current interglacial period, as if nothing had existed before. All the creation sagas of the great religions of the origin of man are located in the brief period of the current interglacial, which is itself an anomaly. On the long time frame of the Pleistocene Ice Age epoch, the interglacial warm periods, especially those of the last 500,000 years, amount to only 15% of the time, with deep glaciation occurring for the remaining 85% of the time, which renders the glacial environment the normal environment of the Earth during the Pleistocene epoch. During the last glaciation environment, water vapor had turned into snow and had accumulated on land so massively over time that the ocean levels had dropped 400 feet. The vast historically known sea level reduction amounts to ice accumulations on land on such a large scale that it defies the imagination. The ice had shaped the landscape. The great inland sea in northern Canada, named Hudson Bay, is believed to have been formed as a depression of the crust of the Earth by the weight of ice accumulations. The Great Lakes in southern Canada may have been carved by moving ice masses. That's the kind of effect that an inactive sun has had on our planet. That's the kind of climate future that available evidence suggests will be upon us again, starting in roughly 30 years when the sun goes inactive. That's what we need to prepare ourselves for, in advance of its happening. While we can continue to live in the energy-reduced climate by relocating ourselves into the tropics, no intention towards addressing this challenge is evident, or it to be even considered. Instead, society keeps its mind and eyes closed. And so, once again, Friedrich Schiller's lament still applies, that all too often the great moments in history find society a little people. Even the world's great champions for scientific progress on the entire front continue nevertheless to live with their mind and eyes closed today on the most critical issues that they do not wish to see, even in the face of monumental evidence that the universe and humanity with it is vastly richer and more powerful than they dare to imagine. Almost all of the great pioneers in the world who sing the tune of science vigorously refuse nevertheless to acknowledge that a human being has the capacity with the mind to recognize the principles that operate in the universe and to look with the mind forward into the future to behold the unfolding of dynamic effects on the cosmic scale 30 years before the visible consequences come to pass. Only the human being has this kind of capacity on the earth. But as Friedrich Schiller laments, society, in spite of its great advances, still refuses all too often to acknowledge itself as human beings. It lets the critical opportunities that open doors to great freedoms and unsurpassed creations pass by unrealized. That's a tragedy that can be healed. We still have time remaining to us to meet the Ice Age challenge fully, to place our agriculture into the tropics, afloat on the seas for the lack of land in the tropics. Together with the building of 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, complete with new industries, all connected with floating bridges and high-speed railways. Any lesser response amounts to society committing collective suicide. Fortunately, it is physically possible to build all the required infrastructures in the 30 years we have remaining in the current interglacial period. But we won't do it if we don't get started. What hinders us in the present is the devil that is in the mind. That is what needs to be challenged. The devil is small-minded thinking, a lack of universal love for our humanity. With the mind blinded by small-mindedness, society has placed itself into a box that has become a trap. This trap is real. It has consequences, especially in astrophysical science. The box of perception in astrophysics had been kept intentionally small, so that 99.999% of the mass of the universe is deemed not to exist. The keeper of the box commands, "What you see is what you get." You see the consequences as they happen. You do not see principles that cause them. Universal principles do not exist. Plasma in space that you cannot see with the eyes does not exist, even when the effects are visible. You are allowed to recognize gravity, and you are commanded to recognize it as the only force in the universe. The command is that anything else does not exist. Of course, the constricted box in which 99.999% of the mass of the universe is deemed not to exist is rather empty, isn't it? In this box, less than 0.001% of the riches of the universe is allowed to be recognized. The keeper of the box tells society, "Don't you dare poke a hole through the box and look at the real world." The command reverberates. It does not exist. Nevertheless, it does exist. The reality is that the dream images that are conjured up in the prism of the box are necessarily fairy tales. Plato illustrated the box as a prison in the form of a cave inside a mountain. The prisoners are chained behind a wall. All that they ever see are reflections on the wall of a fire that is operated by the keepers of the prison, and some shadow images produced by the keepers. But one day, one prisoner breaks the chains and climbs over the wall, and instantly recognizes that the shadows that they all saw, which defined their world, was an illusion. In time, the prisoner notices an exit from the cave, and finds a great wide world outside that he had never imagined to exist. When Schiller laments that society too often fails to respond to the great opportunities before it, he laments, in a sense, that too much of society remains imprisoned by its small-minded, captivating, and often intentionally cultivated illusions. Obviously, if one is psychologically imprisoned into a science that disregards 99.999% of the universe as if it doesn't exist, one lives in a world of fairy tales where extremely little is actually real. Astronomy had been imprisoned for 1,000 years by the doctrine of the Church that all orbits in the heavens must follow perfect circles, because the circle is a perfect geometric form. Consequently, the heavens cannot contain anything less than the most perfect. The astronomer Johannes Kepler was the first man in history who climbed out of the cave and discerned with the mind the greater reality that the senses can never actually see. He liberated astronomy with his discoveries of principles that can only be seen in the mind, by recognizing their effects in the visible universe. Kepler had discovered the result of a process and the principles expressed by it. However, he did not discover the forces that created the process and maintain it. The required technological capability for this advanced discovery to be possible didn't exist in his time, but it exists now. Nevertheless, we are facing the same type of challenge today that he faced, to see with the mind, such as the recognition of plasma in cosmic space and its dynamics, which too can only be recognized by their effects in the visible universe. And this we are capable of. We can see with the power of the mind the great electromagnetic forces of the universe in action, which are inherent in plasma in space, but which no eye has ever seen or ever will be able to see. We can only physically see the consequences of the great cosmic forces. Those consequences are actually amazingly massive, as the story of the Ice Ages hints at. Most of the hard evidence that we have of the previous Ice Ages is relatively recent. Almost all of it didn't exist prior to 1990. The great research efforts and resulting discoveries began around 1990. The year 1990 was the pivotal year when the scientific ventures related to the Ice Ages were beginning to bear fruit. The big ice core drilling projects, both in Antarctica and in Greenland, were launched in the 1990s, and in some cases slightly before. The year 1990 was also the year when the Ulysses spacecraft was launched into orbit around the Sun, that gave us the cleanest and most direct data of the dynamics of the Sun, especially of the solar wind patterns. From its wide polar orbit around the Sun, the Ulysses instrumentation was able to measure the characteristics of the solar wind without the strong interference by the heliospheric current sheet that extends from the equator of the Sun to the edge of the heliosphere. The Ulysses spacecraft was the first and only satellite we ever had that gave us a clean look at the solar wind pressure, which is a critical component for understanding the solar factor of the Ice Age dynamics. All of this means that humanity's Ice Age science hadn't had any real hard and fast physical data to work with prior to 1990, when the big Ice Age drilling projects began and the Ulysses satellite was launched. The development of this data from the 1990s onward renders the Ice Age science a fairly new discipline, as all prior assumptions were built on just vague evidence or mere conjecture. And even this advance was essentially incomplete till the early 2010 time frame, when the breakthrough discoveries were made of the primal fields for the electric sun, for which verification exists in the Ulysses data, which will be shown later. This means that our understanding of Ice Age physics and its consequences is far from being an old hat issue. In fact, the very concept of an Ice Age is relatively new. The occurrence of vast global ice ages in the history of the world hadn't even been postulated until the 1800s. The concept simply didn't exist prior to the 1800s. The little ice age that gripped Europe, centered in time on the mid-1600s, had been seen as nothing more than just a strange climate anomaly when it occurred. To some degree, it is still so regarded by many people who are living in the boxed-in world of constricted science. Way back in time, in the late 1500s, during the early stages of the Little Ice Age, the world had suddenly become colder. No one knew why. Rivers and canals became skating rinks in the winter, as this painting from 1608 illustrates. Later, when the cooling deepened, farms and villages in the Swiss Alps were destroyed by encroaching glaciers. This occurred sometime during the mid-17th century. Even the river Thames froze over at this time, as the painting shows, from 1677. The summers, too, were cold and wet, and with great variability. Crop practices had to be altered to adapt to the shortened, less reliable growing season. Many years of dearth and famine resulted from this climate change. At the time, ice skating became rather popular, as this painting from 1790 shows. The famines were less popular, though. Famines in France and Sweden claimed roughly 10% of the population by starvation, and in Estonia 20%, and in Finland more than 30%. These were hard times. The cold period lasted into the mid-1800s, as the scene shows from Rotterdam in 1825. Nor had the Little Ice Age been a local phenomenon, as some scientists still claim. Ice core records from Antarctica show a marked drop in CO2 concentration in the ice for the period of the Little Ice Age. Lower CO2 levels typically reflect colder global temperatures. It was discovered in much later times that in the middle of the exceedingly cold period, almost no sunspots had occurred on the face of the sun. The lack of sunspots became known as the Maunder minimum. It extended from 1645 to 1715. For a single stretch of 30 years within this period, fewer than 50 sunspots were observed, as compared with 40,000 to 50,000 spots in modern times. However, the coincidence of the Maunder minimum with the cold period had not been recognized until the late 1800s. It had been regarded as unimportant earlier, just as the Little Ice Age phenomenon itself had been regarded as unimportant then. The recognition of its significance was beginning to dawn much later, in the 1800s. A geographer who reported on his journey through the Alps in the mid-1700s had noted large boulders in the valley that shouldn't be where they were. He was told by the locals that the glaciers had once extended far down into the valley, which had probably brought the boulders with them. With the discovery of other such boulders in strange places near glaciers, the idea began to dawn that major glaciation periods had occurred in the past. With it, as an explanation, the idea emerged in the mid-1800s that the climate changes for the theorized ice ages must have been caused by changes in the Earth's orbit. No one at the time imagined that large-scale climate changes could be caused by factors that affect our sun directly. The Maunder minimum hadn't been seen as related evidence then. This connection hadn't been recognized at the time, or it had not been known at the time. The connection between changes in solar activity and the climate on Earth is increasingly being acknowledged. This means that it is also being acknowledged in leading-edge circles that the sun plays a causative role in climate dynamics. While the causative role of the sun is still under dispute by some, the theory that orbital cycles must cause the ice ages is likewise still upheld by them, though no real evidence exists in support of the theory. The modern version of the orbital cycles theory is the Milankovitch cycles theory. It combines three minuscule cyclical variations spanning tens of thousands of years each into a composite climate effect. The theory breaks down, however, when one considers that every single one of the considered cyclical variations has no net effect on the total sunlight received on Earth, even by changes in the orbital eccentricity, as Johannes Kepler had discovered already in the 1600s. The orbital cycles only alter the seasonal and hemispheric distribution of the solar radiation received, which are too minuscule to cause the gigantic ice age phenomena. The evidence that the ice ages are global and not hemispheric did not exist at the time the Milankovitch theory was created, which might not have been created had this fact been known at the time. The evidence for the global ice age is extremely new, so that concrete evidence did not exist prior to the early 1990s, when the deep ice cores were drilled both in Greenland and in Antarctica, which both present identical results. The Russian station Vostok was set up in 1957 and had remained manned year-round thereafter at the coldest spot on Earth, measured at minus 98.2 degrees Celsius. Vostok had drilled its first deep hole in 1990, 2,200 meters deep into the ice. This was a big achievement. The retrieved samples cover a period of 150,000 years into the past. Later drilling reached a depth of 3,623 meters in 1996, which cut through 420,000 years of ice accumulation, spanning almost 4 full glaciation cycles. The Greenland Ice Core project in central Greenland completed its first drilling in 1992. The project had drilled 3,028 meters deep into the ice. It had extracted ice from the last 100,000 years, containing records of the climate in the Northern Hemisphere. The results obtained from Greenland, as one would expect, matched closely the results obtained from Antarctica. The coincidence in the ice from these widely separated drilling sites provides solid proof that ice ages are global phenomena. The ice core samples obtained at the Vostok site in Antarctica further agree with measurements of deep ocean sediments. Of course, all of these measurements themselves do not indicate or even prove what had actually caused the ice ages. Or do they? The Greenland ice cores tell us that the ice age itself, which cuts very deep into the negative temperatures, has many enormous fluctuations occurring within them, some reaching from the deepest low level almost instantly up to near the interglacial level, with transition times sometimes measured in just decades. That these immense temperature swings during the last ice age were not anomalies of a specific drilling site in Greenland became apparent when the deep drilling was repeated a decade later at another location on the Greenland ice sheet, further north, called the North Greenland Ice Core Project. Essentially the same fluctuations were measured there as were measured at the more southern site. The fact that the large fluctuations do not show up in Antarctica may be due to the fact that Antarctica is essentially an ice desert that gets not enough accumulations to preserve the fine details. It is evidently for this reason, too, that the Antarctic ice is sampled for changing ratios of deuterium in the ice, which is a heavy isotope of hydrogen, while at the wetter Greenland, the ratio of the heavy isotope of oxygen, named oxygen-18, is measured. These differences, too, affect the results that can be observed. All of this tells us that the sharply declined details in the Greenland ice are real, and that they speak of immense events that have occurred during the last glaciation period. The truly immense events evidently reflect immense causes, such as the sun becoming reactivated briefly at regular intervals during the glaciation periods. Attempts have been made to explain the gigantic events as resulting from ocean current fluctuations. That's hardly a reasonable possibility in a largely frozen ice age world. Now look at the Little Ice Age in comparison, which we do have records of. The Little Ice Age represents a half a degree of cooling on the cosmic scale. Sure, on the ground the effect seemed big. It changed the landscape and caused famines. But in real terms, the Little Ice Age is almost unrecognizable on a larger scale, where we see fluctuations happening that are 40 times as extensive. Immensely huge events have caused these gigantic fluctuations. The cause for these enormous effects can only be attributed to the Sun. The Maunder minimum points in this direction. During the tiny Little Ice Age, the Sun had weakened enough to lose its sunspots. For the huge events, we will likely see the Sun going inactive completely, because nothing else makes any sense to have an effect on the enormous scale of the events that we have discovered in the ice core data. Our Sun, as a plasma star, is powered by interstellar plasma that is drawn together into plasma streams that typically tie the stars together into strings of various lengths, as the encircled examples show. The electric plasma streams also have a specific electric resonance according to the length of the plasma streams between the stars. The resonance determines the length of time of the ice age cycle. In the solar system, an ice age cycle is presently slightly over 100,000 years in duration. It is made up of an interglacial warm period of typically 12,000 years, in which the Sun is constantly powered, and a 90,000-year glacial period in which the Sun is typically inactive. In principle, the ratio between the active period and the inactive period is determined by the plasma density threshold level, above which the Sun remains active and below which it remains mostly inactive. The active period becomes the interglacial period, and the largely inactive period the glacial period. This means that in principle, the timing of the ice ages is largely determined by the density baseline of the interstellar plasma streams and by their resonance, or a combination of the inflowing and outflowing resonances interacting. In earlier time, the ice age cycles were shorter than they are today, with a duration of 41,000 years. The shorter time suggests that a different resonance and a different baseline was dominant. The orbital cycles of the Milankovitch theory are evidently not causative factors for the ice ages, as their effects are too minuscule. But they were themselves effects of changing, immensely powerful plasma flow pattern. The type of event that is big enough to cause the immense fluctuations, which nothing less could cause than a Sun going inactive, is totally possible for a Sun that is electrically powered, which it obviously is. I have explored this factor of the electric Sun in a previous video. We have plenty of evidence on hand that the Sun is electrically powered by plasma fusion occurring on its surface. We also have evidence on hand that a transition is in progress towards the Sun going inactive in roughly 30 years. And again, this evidence takes us back to 1990, when the big ice core drilling was started. For the focus on the Sun itself, an exploration satellite had been launched in 1990 that had observed the Sun outside the fog in the solar system's ecliptic. On the 6th of October in 1990, the Ulysses space mission was launched from NASA's Space Shuttle Discovery. The Ulysses mission placed a satellite into a polar orbit around the Sun that takes it far outside the ecliptic. The mission used the gravity of Jupiter to swing the satellite out of the ecliptic plane, where solar measurements are inherently affected by the heliospheric current shade that flows there. The deflection of the gravity of Jupiter has put the satellite into an orbit perpendicular to the ecliptic, where nothing disturbs its readings. The Ulysses satellite had reached Jupiter on the 8th of February in 1992. That's when its first solar orbit began. The satellite delivered data for the next 16 years until it was turned off during its third orbit. In these years of operation, it provided 3 major items of critical evidence. It measured over the span of its operation a 30% reduction in the solar wind pressure. That's a huge reduction for such a short period. During its first pass over the South Pole in 1994, the solar wind measure was sharply disrupted. The interference left a gap in the measurement over the South Pole. The same happened again in 1995 over the North Pole of the Sun. The disruption phenomenon was observed for every pass. The disruption may have come as a surprise, but for an electrically powered Sun, the gap is exactly what one would expect to see. It thereby provides evidence that the Sun is electrically powered by plasma focused on it via 2 major primal fields. The disruption matches in principle the plasma flow model that had been discovered in high-powered laboratory experiments at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The disruptions occur where the focused interstellar plasma streams would connect with the Sun, which they obviously do. The second major item of evidence that Ulysses has measured is the astonishing 30% reduction in solar wind pressure between the first and third orbit. The surprise made headlines in the press shortly thereafter the mission was terminated. The satellite's transmitter was turned off on the 30th of June in 2009. The measured 30% drop in solar wind pressure in just 8 years is enormous. In fact, the reduction is gigantic for such a short period. The reduced solar wind pressure had the secondary effect of weakening the shielding effect of the solar heliosphere around the solar system, which shields us against galactic cosmic ray flux. With the reduction in the solar wind pressure, the Ulysses satellite had measured a corresponding 20% increase in cosmic ray flux over the same time frame. These are all items of hard evidence that big changes are in progress in the solar system. In an electric sun system, the solar wind can be likened to steam boiling off from a heated kettle. When the plasma input exceeds the density that the plasma fusion reactions can consume, the excess pressure is vented off by the primal fields and becomes the solar wind. The solar wind measurements thereby become a measure of the health of the solar system. When one sees a 30% drop in just 8 years, such evidence becomes cause for great concern. If one projects the process forward in a linear manner on the basis of a 30% drop in 10 years, the solar wind will likely have diminished to zero by 2030. From this point on, the solar radiation itself would begin to diminish progressively towards the sun going inactive at some point. The cutoff event will likely happen between the 2030s and the 2050s. Once this happens, the magnetic primal fields collapse. It will take a big increase in plasma flow density for the primal fields to form anew. During the last glaciation period, the recovery of the sun occurred in intervals of 1470 years. That primal fields can become established quickly when the conditions are right, and vanish quickly when the conditions are exhausted, is evident in the occurrence of red sprite events that occasionally become visible in the tropics high above large storm clouds. The sprite events flare up, but rarely last for more than a second. The larger events of our interglacial sun has so far lasted for roughly 12,000 years, which is typical for interglacial periods. Once the sun goes inactive, like a sprite turning off, it will likely continue to glow for a long time by residual processes, although at a much reduced energy level, at probably 30% of the present level. The resulting enormous reduction in radiated energy would certainly be large enough to cause the gigantic ice age cooling that the ice cores tell us of. The shock effect of the solar fusion consumption of plasma being interrupted may eventually recover the incoming plasma density enough for the sun to start up again for a short period. The periodic nature of the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations suggests that such on and off events were happening throughout the last ice age, with the results as shown here. This is the kind of rapid transition in the Earth's environment that we need to prepare our world for, which we need to complete in the few years of interglacial time that we may have remaining, possibly 30 years, if that. The lead time that we may still have is short. It is short because the entire discovery process of the ice age dynamics didn't really begin until the early 1990s, when the deep ice core drilling began and the Ulysses satellite was launched to explore the connection with the sun. The earlier connection between the weaker sun of the Maunder minimum and the colder climates at that time had been on record and fully out in the open back in the 1600s, but no one had seen the connection. No one had connected the two events then. We are back in the same boat again from the 1990s onward. The evidence of big events stands before us. The ice core evidence is plain. It has been measured in details, and the measurements were recorded. The Ulysses spacecraft saw the solar system getting dramatically weaker while it orbited. But will we connect the dots? It is as if we needed a third set of evidence to jolt us to attention. This third set of measurements was produced on the ground in the high Arctic of Canada in the form of magnetic measurements that tracked the Earth's magnetic pole drifting northward. This is significant. But what does it mean? It means that we see evidence here of a dramatic weakening of the magnetic strength of the primal fields that are affecting the Earth's magnetic dynamo effect. The magnetic effect of the spinning of the Earth by the principle of magnetic fields causes the magnetic field lines to be formed along the spin axis of the Earth. If no other factors are applied, the Earth's magnetic North Pole becomes identical with the Earth's geographic North Pole. However, if one considers that the Earth orbits within the giant sphere of the primal fields, a second magnetic force affects the Earth. This second force, which has a different orientation, is extremely dominant. It will pull the effective magnetic pole into its direction for a maximum deflection of 23 degrees, according to the tilt of the spin axis of the Earth. In 1831, at the time when the Earth just recovered from the Little Ice Age, the measured deflection was 20 degrees. This was a large deflection caused by strong primal fields. From this time on, slowly at first, the deflection of the magnetic pole, as it was measured on the ground, drifted closer and closer towards the geographic pole. The measured drift tells us that the primal fields are weakening, whereby the dynamo effect becomes increasingly more dominant. That the magnetic pole drift was not caused by the Earth itself is evident by the corresponding weakening of the Sun that has been measured by the Ulysses spacecraft between 1992 and 2008. We are evidently looking at a large weakening of the solar system being in progress. Of course, as the Little Ice Age tells us, the weakening of the solar system began already much earlier in time. The ice core samples from Greenland tell us that the weakening of the solar system began as far back as 3,000 years ago, slowly at first, but has gradually accelerated. The dramatic but fast weakening that Ulysses saw, which is evident also in the magnetic pole drift, suggests that now a terminal phase has begun. It is tempting to hope that the presently indicated trend will somehow reverse before the Sun goes inactive. Hasn't the solar system recovered from the Little Ice Age? Yes, it has recovered, but it recovered from a stronger base. The stronger base is evident in the stronger deflection of the magnetic pole by the primal fields. The deflection at the worst of the Little Ice Age hadn't drifted nearly as close to the geographic pole than we have it today. This means that the primal fields were far stronger then. This apparent paradox tells us that the effective field strength of the primal fields has not a single source, but is the effective composite of three nested primal fields overlaid upon one another. It was theorized in 1932 by the Dutch astronomer Jan Oort and the Estonian astronomer Ernst Öpke that a spherical cloud of asteroid objects surrounds the solar system up to a distance of close to a light year. The cloud is theorized to be made up of two nested parts, an inner part that extends for less than a third of it, and a larger outer sphere. The sun, located deep within it, is just a tiny speck. If one regards this two-part giant phenomenon as a part of a large plasma flow system and plasma concentration system, then we can recognize the existence in principle of a threefold nested complex of primal fields, with each having a correspondingly longer resonance characteristic. The outer Oort cloud, by its size, would likely have a resonance that corresponds with the dense Gordijske oscillations during the glaciation period. The long resonance of the outer Oort cloud may also be a causative element for the big spikes that we see as warming events in interglacial time. The resonance of the inner Oort cloud, being much smaller in size, would be reflected in the shorter cyclical events such as we see in the 250-year cooling of the Little Ice Age and the subsequent 250-year rewarming afterwards. The still strong magnetic pole deflection during the Little Ice Age suggests that there was still a lot of strength left in the outer Oort cloud, which we don't have this time around. This is what the green line indicates. It means that the 250-year downswing that has now begun is beginning in a dramatically weaker environment. Without the strong backup that still existed during the Little Ice Age, the sun will likely go inactive this time around, long before the current 250 years down cycle has ended. It is more likely that the diminishment of the solar wind pressure will accelerate instead of being reversed by a strong backup. No evidence exists that a backup is in the works for a significant reversal to take place. Society is foolishly gambling with its very existence by assuming that the reversal of the current dynamics will magically happen that would justify its refusal to prepare the world for the impending Ice Age transition in roughly 30 years. The current gamble that the near Ice Age will pass us by is a gamble that all evidence tells us we will lose. This is an insane gamble. To put it bluntly, the evidence tells us that we are on the fast track to an icy hell. The last ice age transition measured in the ice of North Greenland gives us a hint of what we are up against. When all of this evidence is fitted together in the mind into a single package of science perception, which takes us beyond what the eye can see, alarm bells should be ringing. The alarm bells should signal that the final phase towards the next glaciation event is most likely in progress, towards an inactive sun, and that no form of gambling with the future existence of humanity is justified. But why aren't alarm bells ringing? The simple answer is that the science is being depressed for political objectives by the masters of the world empire who have waged a war against scientific progress for centuries. The reason was stated bluntly and repeatedly by the masters of the ruling empire. It has been stated that scientific progress is the greatest danger to any feudal oligarchic system of empire, because empire exists by the looting of society. Empire protects itself by keeping society small, impotent, and its science depressed. The details involved are too many to list here. However, a few points of evidence in modern time are noteworthy. One point to note is that the scientific community became concerned already in the early 1970s about what must be done to protect humanity against the approaching ice age. The scientific community called for a world forum to discuss the subject. The World Forum was convened in 1974. However, it was staged in an upside-down form as the UN Conference on Population in Bucharest, where the announcement of the global warming doctrine was made, for which no evidence really exists, but which was immensely promoted thereafter. In the shadow of the global warming doctrine that was essentially a hoax, the super-secret, infamous NSSM 200 policy was quietly concocted in the same year, 1974, which targeted third world nations for controlled depopulation. The timing coincidence strongly colors the real intention for the global warming doctrine and takes it far outside the realm of science. Today, 30 years later, the global warming doctrine is murdering up to 100 million people a year with starvation by the mass burning of food in the form of biofuels. The scientific community protested against the penetrated hoax that was barely becoming recognized then for what it was. The science community responded with numerous petition projects to inspire the leaders of the world to act on truthful scientific evidence instead of on contrived imperatives. The largest of the resolving opposition projects garnered 17,000 signatures from the scientific community worldwide. But those became promptly ignored in the political world, as the truth really wasn't on the agenda. One opposition project that you have probably never heard of either was launched by the US Senate. The project published 400 detailed statements of scientific opposition to the global warming doctrine. It was presented by concerned individuals with an academic degree. This masked voice, too, was simply ignored. One promoter of the political hoax project stated that each one in the scientific community must decide for himself where the balance lies between being truthful and being effective. On this platform, a banner has been erected high over the land of science that reads, "In lies we trust." Under the established banner, many a published scientific data has evidently been sanitized by omission or corrections. Sometimes, however, the pollution of the truth makes it briefly past the gods and is seen by the public, as did the image shown here of a gigantic event over the North Pole of the Sun, photographed by the SOHO spacecraft. This image, with all its different spectra, was deleted from the published data on the next day. It is unknown to what extent published scientific data is routinely sanitized in order to assure the purity of the pablum that is dished up for society. Often the pablum is sweetened with fairy tale dust. It was revealed, for example, during the time of the 2009 climate change conference that, based on the publication of several hundred of emails collected from the servers of relevant institutions, which show that the bulk of the data that is fed to the public in support of the global warming scare has simply been made up. One of the early activists on the front of Truth for Science was an atmospheric scientist who had been associated with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory for 23 years and has served for 20 years as an air weather officer for the U.S. Air Force. He describes in an article how the big international protest movements against false science had developed from 1992 on. This occurred with the big ice core drillings going on in the background. The first big opposition movement in the science community, which most people never heard of, started in Germany in 1992 at the University of Heidelberg. It was followed up 5 years later at the University in Leipzig, and then again with a major effort organized in Oregon in the USA, and so on. The great protest movements had produced over 50,000 signatures and statements from the scientific community, from numerous countries, with numerous Nobel laureates among the respondents. The Heidelberg Appeal that went out to the scientific community in 1992 was responded by over 4,000 scientists, including 69 Nobel laureates from 69 countries. It was hoped that such a wide-based voice would have an impact on the policymakers at the Rio Earth Summit. Of course, since the truth was not on the agenda there, the voices from the science community were not even heard. Dr. Ellis here states that over 35 organizations had been publicly standing up against the global warming doctrine at this time, whose voices were simply ignored. The Leipzig Declaration had solicited only meteorologists and climate specialists for a completely focused statement on the issue. It had collected 110 signatures from this highly specialized group. The resulting statement by leading-edge specialists in the field was subsequently submitted to the Kyoto Climate Conference. But there as it had already become the norm by then. Their voices were simply ignored. In the shadow of this ban of the truth, the Oregon Petition Project against the global warming doctrine was launched. It was launched as a protest against the Kyoto agreements that were referred to by the Russian Academy of Science as a global suicide pact. The Oregon Petition Project went out to all scientists worldwide to gain their written support for a campaign to urge the nations of the world to reject the Kyoto Agreement. The world responded with 17,000 signatures from scientists, mostly with high degrees, standing in opposition to these unscientific assumptions of the global warming dogma. The project seemed to have succeeded significantly, as only a few nations have actually ratified the Kyoto Agreement. As I already noted, other protests followed in later years. One of these was the big 2007 Senate report, which presents a collection of over 400 detailed opposing submissions, mostly from the academic community, each one outlining the individual's reason for opposing the global warming dogma. Their statements are all online. But by then, the issue of global warming as a world issue was already essentially dead, except as a political issue of insanity. The 2009 Copenhagen Climate Change Conference that was designated to revive the global warming hoax promptly failed spectacularly. It collapsed without a single agreement. It had drifted insanely far into the realm of purely imperial objectives, with no scientific foundation for anything to support anything. At the end, India simply walked out in disgust. Hopefully, the still continuing forced opposition against the Ice Age dynamics will someday soon similarly fizz out into nothing, as we are running out of time on this front. Among the voices in the scientific community warning of the return of the Ice Age was the world-renowned atmospheric scientist and mountaineer Professor Zbigniew Jaworowski, who also served as chairman of the Scientific Council of the Central Laboratory for Radiological Protection in Warsaw. He wrote in a paper in 2003 that the transition period to the deep cold temperatures can be as short as 1 to 2 years and can begin virtually without warning, or that the transition might unfold slowly over a span of 50 years. The professor speaks to us as a world-renowned atmospheric scientist who has excavated ice out of 17 glaciers on 6 continents in a 50-year career. He warns us that the cyclical ice age transition is already half a millennium overdue. For the timing, Professor Zbigniew Jaworowski quotes other sources in his paper that suggest that the transition may occur between 50 to 150 years from the present. More accurate forecasts were hard to make at the time, since the dynamics of primofields had not been discovered in 2003. However, the professor points out at the end of his paper that continuous on-the-ground temperature measurements taken at the Solar Terrestrial Institute in Irkutsk, in southern Siberia, have registered a sharp drop in annual average temperature beginning in 1998, which became later confirmed by the solar measurements of NASA's Ulysses mission, and by corresponding measurements of magnetic pole drift in the high Arctic of Canada and beyond. And so Professor Jaworowski simply suggests the ice age is coming, get the fur coats out of the closet. The coming ice age is definitely not off the horizon in the scientific thinking of the world. It is just beginning to unfold. The subject is merely pushed off the stage at the present time by political forces in defense of the Western oligarchic imperial system that has no natural foundation to exist and thus cannot exist in the light of honest scientific development, especially the huge development that is mandated by the Ice Age dynamics. The enormous economic development that is required to prepare the world for human living under an inactive sun, with 6,000 new cities being built in the tropics for 1 million people each, mostly afloat, all with completely new industries and agriculture alongside, and with everything being constructed in the short span of 30 years, would sweep the imperial looting system out of existence. For this reason, the very notion of the Ice Age challenge is being resisted, and the related fields of evidence are being sanitized into oblivion. The result that we see here may answer the question that is sometimes asked about the near potential of the sun going inactive and the lack of evidence for it in the sky. People ask, why have no such events been detected with telescopes or by the Kepler spacecraft that searches for faint intensity changes in stars? The mission searches for the faintest changes in light density that would signify orbiting distant stars. Wouldn't such a mission see a sun going inactive somewhere? The reason why no such events have been reported may simply mean that these cases have either been sanitized out of existence by the planet-scanning computer software that is not programmed for large changes, or that such occurrences are sanitized by the parameters that limit the reporting of what is seen. It may also be that not a single sun of the 145,000 stars that the Kepler mission had monitored in its narrow field of vision has gone inactive during its slightly over 2 years of operation. It may also be the case that solar cutoff events may not happen near our space for a few decades yet, till the weakening has not sufficiently progressed, and even then there may not be many candidates for it. Our sun is officially designated as a weak yellow dwarf, which in addition is located in a relatively sparsely populated part of space, where it is more vulnerable to weakening supply conditions. Our sun, as a G-class star, is not a particularly strong star, though it is stronger than most. 88% of the stars in the galaxy are smaller and dimmer stars than our sun, with a radically lower rate of plasma consumption to sustain their lesser fusion reactions. The great giant stars, in comparison, are extremely rare, at less than 0.75% of all the stars. The giants are typically located at the center of large plasma supply streams. The F-class stars that are slightly larger than our sun and make up 3% of all the stars are several times more luminous than our sun, which means that they too operate in a relatively strong supply system. Those stars may have been the class that was selected for the study by the Kepler mission for their brightness. All this means that the stars the size of our Sun, which are up to 5 times dimmer, may be the most vulnerable of the stars to supply fluctuations, and might not have been studied by the Kepler mission because of their lower intensity. The Kepler spacecraft operates a single instrument, a photometer, which continuously monitors the brightness of over 145,000 specifically selected stars in a fixed field of view. The selected stars may have been mostly the larger F-class stars for their brightness, which would likely be less affected by weakening conditions in the space around the solar systems. All this means that it cannot be said that the Kepler mission has delivered absolute proof that no sun anywhere has ever gone inactive, as has been suggested. When the inactivation of a sun occurs, which should typically be rare and occur quickly, the result would likely be missed, unless one specifically looks for such events. The Kepler mission officially detected no such events, nor was it designed to do so. It operated for a brief span from December 2009 till May 11, 2013. While it operated, a greater than expected noise-to-data ratio was experienced from both the stars and the spacecraft itself, which means that the results were not as clean as expected and open to errors. Some evidence, however, does exist for the existence of inactive stars. The visible form of inactive stars is termed a white dwarf. White dwarf stars are shown here with a circle around them. When a plasma-powered sun goes inactive, it continues to attract with its gravity whatever atomic material exists in its surroundings. The attracted material then filters down to the sun's core, where the atoms become crushed by the still existing large gravity. The resulting nuclear fission in the core emits a tiny speck of bright light that is seen at the center of a previous sun. The brilliant light from the atomic fissioning would be rather small in size in comparison with the actual size of the, by then, dark plasma sphere that was once a sun. Of course, this evidence, too, of the inactive state of a sun is being sanitized into obscurity by the Big Bang-related theory of the entropic universe, where every sun is doomed to eventually collapse by explosion or implosion and is left to die away into nothing, with the white dwarf theorized to occur at the end stage. Thus the global landscape has become a landscape of many obviously false theories. The fascination with false theories had persisted from historic time to ours, such as the widely held theory that war is inevitable and beneficial, or the more modern theory that nuclear war can be avoided with the terror threats of wielding many tens of thousands of nuclear bombs. And also that an economy is benefited by the process of financial mass looting, and that humanity will be saved by the coveted depopulation of the earth with genocide, as we have it in progress now, and that such a pursuit is a sane objective, so that its fascism will stabilize the imperial landscape. On the science front, the evidently false theories have likewise many prominent candidates, such as the global warming theory, the theory of the Big Bang creation, the theory of the internally heated hydrogen fusion sun, the theories of neutron stars, theories about black holes in space, and about stars collapsing into supernova shockwave fireworks. Fortunately, as with all false theories, their dominant standing can fade into nothing when discoveries of truth raise perceptions to higher platforms, where old hypotheses are simply superseded with higher hypotheses that bring us closer to the truth. An error in science fades into nothing all by itself when the truth becomes more clearly recognized, understood, and acknowledged. This too is known since ancient times. Here we see the path for our future, the path of human development built on scientific development. I like to predict that we stand at the threshold today for a breakout from many false theories that have kept us tied to the dust of the earth, the dust of impotence, for far too many ages already, whereby we discover us as human beings with a quality in scientific truthfulness and creative power that renders us collectively as the supreme being on earth, second to none. On this path of our self-discovery as humanity, we will meet the immense Ice Age challenge, most surely, possibly along the way of it, perhaps even as a secondary issue in the flow of the unfolding power of our universal humanity.